Welcome to Games of the Week. For those of you who are joining from my choice, which was like 5 minutes ago, I'm glad you stuck with us. Last lecture we talked about English opening, my game from black side. This is also in Gibraltar. Both games, both my game and Wang Hao's game happened in Gibraltar, but different years and slightly different ratings. And this game, white was the one who had the upper hand most of the game, but in my game, I was the one who had the upper hand as black. So also they are slightly different in the opening, even though they share a lot of similarities. They're like just different variations. So without further ado, let's jump in.
Who's playing in this game?
Oh, it's Wang Hao against Praggnanandhaa. It was like 3 days ago. All right, we good? All right, so c4, e5. This is for some reason called the 4-knight variation. I assume just because the 4 knights come out. So there are different ways to play here. You could go for g3, you could go with e3. G3, the idea is that you would play d5 as black, most likely. And now, after bishop g2, you just put your knight on b6. Again, usually, probably you do have the option of taking in this specific situation, and then e4. But typically, this is the structure that you would get into. You would have these bishops here, and black's game is in queen side, whereas white's game would be in like center and more center and slightly queen side, more mainly for defense and keeping it all together. But so another variation to play with white is this e3. Now, if e3, black can't really do these d5s anymore, so you kind of have to play bishop b4. Queen comes to c2. Again, this is also theory. And after d6, so black's plan is kind of clear. Black wants to play short castle, still undecided about where this bishop should go from c8. But one thing that's kind of obvious is this knight on f6 is very misplaced. So you kind of will try to bring it here, so it's protecting more squares and dominating this side. And since white has 2 bishops, white would most likely try and open up the center with maybe d4, e4, stuff like that. So these are the general ideas to follow. And in the game, Wang Hao played e4. And after castle, g3 was played. I'm assuming simply because just bishop wants to come to g2, castle, and d4. Because probably if d4 now, it might be a little too early, because knight e4 is possible, and then there is this rook e8, and it's simply not the best idea to open up the center where your king is still in the center. So g3, knight d7, as mentioned earlier, this knight wants to come to c5, bishop g2, knight c5. Again, d4 doesn't work yet because of simply taking, and then rook e8. So knight c5. Whoops. All right. Now after knight c5, white could probably simply make castle, but white decided to go with knight h4. So the idea is that after knight h4, now if it was white to move again, white could play d4, right? Because if d4, now that knight takes e4 at the end of the variation doesn't work, because bishop simply takes on e4 and there won't be a rook e8 pinning the queen. There won't be a queen on e4 to be pinned. So knight came to h4. I'm not very familiar with this specific variation, but it kind of makes sense for black to try and do something in the queen side, because white has a lot of weaknesses and ideas to work on in the king side. So specifically, probably coming up f4, d4. These are some of the ideas that could be worked on. And in the game, Praggnanandhaa, I hope I'm pronouncing it correct, I think I am, was played a6. Now castle. Now take a little bit of time and think, what should black do? I'll be looking at the chat. Okay, we have some ideas with f5. It is black's to move. So f5 doesn't work simply because just logically it's not the best idea to open up the center when your opponent has two bishops. Also f5, you would kind of be giving up the pawn, which is not something that worries me that much because you could just come take it back, but your rhythm of the game would kind of be distracted. So that is why I kind of remember how I talked about moving, like thinking about the queen side. So keep thinking about doing stuff in the queen side. You brought your f6 knight all the way to c5 to the queen side, so you should try and follow it up with queen side ideas. Okay, I do like the idea with bishop e6, queen d7, but the problem with bishop e6 specifically is that white could simply play d3, and then whenever white is ready to play d4, like right now, right now d4 wouldn't work because simply take, and knight can take. But whenever white is ready, maybe a bishop to b2, maybe bishop to e3, then d4 is very dangerous because attacking the knight and d5 coming. Oh, Mr. Carter is right. The right move is b5. Also Benjamin, anyways, he's also right. Also Paul. Oh, a lot of people are saying it. Great. Yeah, b5 is the right idea. Now b5, if white takes it, black's position is really nice. This rook is open, attacking this guy over here. Black has a clear idea how to proceed in the queen side, whereas so if not take, what should white do? So we don't want to take. No, c takes b5. What else? Okay, so we have d3 ideas, a lot of d3. Knight f5, it's a little early, but the knight eventually will jump there. Okay, remember how I was talking about two bishops and opening center and stuff? So think about a move, not d3. d3 is the problem with d3 is that black could just take, and your pawn structures are really kind of I'll go with the word unpleasant. So maybe try another more active move. Okay, I do see. Okay, Paul, you are right. I think the first one to say d4 might have overlooked something, but d4 is the right move to play, because now that you play d4, your opponent kind of has to take it. Now that when you take back, if knight takes d4, here you do have to move the queen. So you kind of have two good options, queen to d2 or queen to b2. Which one would you prefer to play? d4 was a very good move. So for those of you who said it, good job. For those of you who had it as a candidate move, still good job. For those of you who didn't think about it, you have a lot of opportunities to see good moves. We have a bunch of queen d2s. A lot of queen d2s. One so far, queen b2. Okay. I'll give it another minute and then I'll say it. Ah, now queen c3, be careful, knight e2 check. Okay. So queen. We still have a lot of queen d2s. We do have. So I think the problem is that after queen b2, you are worried about. Okay, that's not a valid scare, and I did see a never mind. Okay, so queen b2 was happened in the game, which from what I understand was a novelty, But let's look at what if queen went to d2. If queen d2, knight goes back to c6, e5 for example, bishop out, everything is exchanged, and this was actually a game between Ildar Hayrulin and Peter Svidler in 2015, which ended in a draw. But in this game, queen b2 was played, which to my understanding again is a little bit more active and keeps a lot of opportunities in the middle game, whereas in queen d2, as we saw, followed by, for example, e5 and e takes d6, white is still okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but since you have sacrificed a pawn, ideally you would want to keep the game very active and give your opponent chances to make mistake. So after queen b2, knight c6. So now if it was black to move, what would you want to do as your next move? Again, it's white to move, but I'm just asking for you to think about your opponent. If you just played something like king h1 or something just super chill, what would your opponent do? Yes, go Tracy. Let's see if I have anybody on the live chat. Okay, if it was black to move, black would ideally want to place this knight to e5 to have domination over this square and all of these fun pawns under attack. So now that as white we know what black wants, you kind of have to try and stop it. The best way to do it is to play e5. And the idea is also the fact that your bishop is kind of becoming a superhero over here. You're opening up your bishop. You can't really take back with the knight because your rook will fall. So your knight is under attack as black. So your next move should be pretty much something to defend the knight. And now as white, I get to keep opening the center. So just compare it to here, the move right before playing d4. Compare this position to this position. Even though white has one pawn less, the position is very open. This bishop is like a superhero. This queen is very well placed. This knight could try and jump onto f5 any day. And this bishop is the only thing that could be better in this diagonal, ideally. And even though you're not entirely sure where to place your rooks, it's not that hard to come up with a good square for them. Whereas for black, the problem is that none of black's pieces know where to go. Probably your rook c8 will be coming up just because this knight is pinned and you want to unpin it. But where should you place your queen? What is this bishop doing in d7? So, in the game, at this point, Wang Hao plays queen d2. I'm not sure if I would have played it, to be honest, because I probably wouldn't have seen it. Ideally, I'd like to think I would. But I think the idea is very simple. Queen d2 is simply attacking this guy, and next move you want to play bishop b2, maybe queen c3 and go for the jugular. So after rook c8, c takes b5, knight comes to e5 because the knight was free. Now take on a6, and if it was white to move again, white would have most likely started going to use this advantage of this pawn. So maybe something like bishop b2 won't work anymore because of knight c4. Maybe something like bishop a3 to attack the knight that's attacking my pawn. Maybe I could even try for something like a4 to take away squares such as b5 from my opponent. But anyways, it is black to move, and black did play bishop b5. This was for me very, very interesting game, and it was kind of very challenging to actually find the right moves. So if you can't find the exact right move, don't beat yourself up. Just try to understand the ideas, and keep in mind that we are looking at super grandmasters who played this game literally 3 days ago. So after bishop comes to b5, so this pawn feels like it's kind of falling, right? But be careful because your rook on f1 is under attack. Rook d1 seems to be the best move, especially because this pawn is under attack. So if you were to simply take my pawn, I could simply take your pawn, and then we would go to an endgame that it's better for white. White is a pawn up and has 2 bishops. This is also a passed pawn. It's not a double pawn. So bishop comes to a4 to attack the rook to kind of distract it. Rook e1. No. Knight comes to d3. It looks a little scary, right? There might be some ideas with rook c2, f2 pawn. So what do you think white should do? I mean specifically in this position, but also overall. For example, you probably you're going to suggest moves that you would move the rook, but after you move the rook, what are some of the ideas that you see on the board? And one suggestion, keep thinking about how black's pieces are, most of them kind of like hanging. They don't really have good protection, and keep thinking about that idea. I'll be looking at the chat, so we could I will see suggestions there as well. Okay, so some people want to sacrifice the exchange. Okay, so one thing about sacrifice that is usually correct is when you want to sacrifice something, it either has to be positional or you're doing it as like a real sacrifice, not just an exchange. Either has to be positional, that you would gain something very specific out of the position, or it were simply like an attacking dynamics sacrifice. But the thing is, if you play something like rook e5 now, it simply doesn't work because black pieces are way more ready and way more active than your pieces. So like That's kind of the main problem. If you were to sacrifice the e1 rook, you would be giving up one of your few active pieces. If your bishop on c1 was somewhere else and it was active, and the rook on a1 was also active, then yes, it would have been a good place to think about a sacrifice, but it's not. So I didn't really see any suggestions on the move that was actually played on the game. So in the game they played, Wang Hao played rook f1. The idea is very simple, because my opponent wants to play rook at c2 and then take on my pawn. So I simply go back and I protect my pawn. So the thing is, one thing that I thought about was, so probably here, after bishop b5, rook d1, bishop a4, what if I just played rook f1? And then I thought, well, my opponent would just repeat it because, well, I don't want a repetition. So probably that is why after bishop a4, rook e1 was kind of like luring your opponent to play this knight d3 to block that bishop b5 idea. And now after rook c2, queen e3, one of the big ideas is this f4 coming up. Because if I get to play f4, I'm attacking your knight on e5, and if you move the knight on e5, your knight on d3 would be falling. Whoops. So that is the big idea. And so the move that black does should be something to protect this d3 knight, or to move this d3 knight. In the game, my opponent, well, not my opponent, black, Wang Hao's opponent, played knight c5, which I completely understand and agree with. The problem is that f4 is not the only idea that white has. So white wants to play f4 and go after this guy, right? So ideally, well, I won't be complaining about winning a piece, but if black were to not allow this to happen and play something like knight c5, the idea of a7 still is very valid. So the queen on e3 is also looking here to protect the a7 pawn. And now it's getting a little scary, right? a8, new queen protected by the bishop on g2. So bishop c6 is pretty forced, because if not bishop c6, then a8 were to be queen. Bishop exchanged, and now queen comes to f3. This was very interesting positionally, because you just simply exchanged the bishops off, and instead you placed your queen on that big diagonal. And one other thing that we kind of heard a lot about, but we don't always apply it, is to centralize your pieces, especially your queen, given the chance. And right now this queen needs to be centralized. Like, you could move this queen to, for example, a3 and still keep it behind that pawn and still have nice ideas. You could put it on h5 and try to go for some attacky ideas, but queen d5 is the best one, because you're centralizing your queen. You are attacking this knight. You might have ideas with bishop e3. You could keep thinking about pushing this. You could even think about something like this. So in the game, Praggnanandhaa played knight e2 check, king g2, and here black had one move that would have reduced white's advantage slightly, but so here white has good advantage. It's not winning, it's simply advantage, but black had a move to try and decrease that advantage. Tip: knight c3 was played in the game, and that is not the move that was best. So try to think about the best move, and also think about what pieces are not working and how to activate them. I'll still be looking at the chat and hope for some cool ideas. Okay, ooh. Yeah, it is black to move, and we do have somebody found the right move. 2 people. Nice.
So wouldn't they just threaten the queen?
What?
Wouldn't they just threaten the queen by moving knight to c3?
Nope. Well, yes, it is true, and they did play it in the game, but it's not the best one. Mattel is right. Mr. Carter is right. So I'll just touch on it very briefly because we still have, they still have kind of played about 20 more moves. But just to keep it simple, Queen A5 was the best move. And the idea is quite simple. You just want to take out this pawn that is very annoying you. And also you might have some, depending on what white would do, there could be some ideas with coming to probably c3, attacking. Again, really depends on white. What would white do? But, cool. So, in the game after knight c3, queen comes back to f3, keeping it close to the queen, keeping it close to the king, and again keeping this pawn protected, supported. And now in the game they play, Praggnanandhaa played queen a8. Queens could be exchanged off, and it's not a bad move to follow, but the white has a better move. Think about it this way: if you were to exchange the queens off, you would automatically give your opponent the gift of one tempi, that this rook comes to a8, keeps attacking on a7, and now your pieces are still a little disoriented. Whereas if you were to play a move such as knight f5, now if the queens were get to exchange, and if like something like rook a8, first off, you could consider a move such as rook e1 to go for e8, or you could simply think about, alright, I'll take this pawn, I'll be happy. Or if you want to be even sneakier, you could play knight d4. Now, the rook is kind of trapped, isn't it? So, that is the idea behind the knight f5, that if you were to exchange the queens off, I am both attacking your pawn and coming to d4, and your rook would be trapped. So, rook went to rook shouldn't go to a8 because the other rook will be trapped. So, in the game, queen takes a7 was played, and here bishop f4 was played, but it's not the most accurate move. I'd like to give you all 1 minute to try and find it. It is kind of, alright, let me see, I don't want to give up the move, but Okay, the tip that I will give you is that your queen and your knight are kind of looking at the king side, aren't they? So think about that.
Queen G4.
That's a very simple move. Queen G4 is a good idea, but you have something more feisty. Oh, Mateo, good job. Let's see if I can read. I'm gonna give my Arabic reading a try. I might fail. I apologize for the pronunciation in advance. Al-Zahirat al-Mastadirat. You are also right. Bishop h6. Sydney, you're right. For those of you who said bishop h6 and thought about bishop h6, good job. Bishop h6 is not an easy move. So like if I were playing this game, because up until now the game has been very positional, right? You just keep trying to advance your pieces, push more, and you're not really thinking about sacrificing your pieces just yet. So it is very understandable if you didn't really consider this move. There's nothing wrong with that. Also, white's position is good enough to be able to convert the advantage to a win without bishop h6, but what is chess without a little tactics? So if bishop h6, you were to take queen g4, and it's see you next game. But the only way to defend it is with knight e6, and if knight e6, now this might be a real threat. So nope, we do not want to sacrifice more pieces. So the way to play it is to simply play a move such as rook c1. So you're kind of sacrificing, but not really. Like, your bishop is just there keeping the threat, but at the same time you're activating your other pieces. So if rook takes c1, I'm attacking your c3 knight. And if you were to move the knight, for example, take on a2, I could simply try and bring this rook to the attack. So that is why bishop h6 is such a nice move, and it is again perfectly fine if you didn't think about it or put it as your candidate moves. Bishop f4 was played in the game at 27, a super grandmaster with a rating of 2758 didn't play bishop h6, so don't be too hard on yourself. After bishop f4, very positional move, Black played knight e6, which is again a very good move, attacking this active bishop. And honestly, this pawn was about to fall regardless. So take on d6, knight to g5, Now, remember how I talked about centralizing your pieces and everything, especially your queen? Now, how do you want to do that? Yes. Okay, so the best way to try and centralize your queen is to put the queen on c6. Even though it's a little scary to have the queen against this rook, this knight is kind of pinned, so if you move the knight, rook goes for free. So even though queen d3 is nice, the move queen d3 is interesting, you kind of have to be careful with giving up this diagonal to your opponent. So queen c6 is the best move, and in this situation, Praggnanandhaa realized that he kind of has to try and exchange the queens off of the board, because if not, this is under attack, and pretty much next move this knight could become under attack. Knight e3 is coming on the board, so the best way for black to try and survive this is with queen a8. White has to take, and now keep in mind that this pawn is under attack, so simply play a3 to keep your pawn. Now, for black, the best try is to keep the knights in the center, and for white, the best try is to try and exchange this guy off, because this is very, very annoying for white and quite strong for black. See how this rook is kind of dominating and paralyzing white's hand? It would be very nice if this rook was exchanged off, right? So just play rook c1. Take, take. Now, if black were to take on d6, I believe that simply taking it would be sufficient enough, because if rook takes on a3, there is a little tactic here. I will give you 30 seconds to find it. Okay, everybody is saying it. Awesome. Everybody's right. Knight b5, and it is kind of bye-bye time. Probably something like knight e4 is also winning, but knight b5 is just better. Anywho, so the best way for black to deal with this weak back rank is to open up escape route for the king. How? With g6. Now, check king out. If king were to go to h8, what do we do? Check, and then we can take, or same applies for if king comes to g7. So king kind of has to go to f8, and now we get this oh, I don't want to say it, I might have accidentally showed it, but just keep thinking about it, keep thinking about it's actually not that hard. Everybody would be able to see it, right? Take. Now, if the king, it's double check, so you kind of have to move with the king. And if the king were to go to center, even though this bishop is under attack and the knight is under attack, you could just simply move the knight to e5 or f4. I prefer e5 just because of centralization. And then if take. So the king went to g7. I don't really think that's much difference between king e8 or g7. g7 kind of just tries to keep the squares on the king side more. So knight h4, this is coming up, right? So black kind of has to take that bishop and exchange. Exchange, well, it wasn't like direct exchange, so. Now, in this point, we have reached from a super strategic game to a super getting a little dynamic game, and then to a kind of a theoretical end game. So the king, rook and knight versus king, rook and knight is kind of, you have to be quite accurate to play it. And for example, in the game, Praggnanandhaa played knight b5, which is a very logical move, right? You want to just take on a3 pawn. But rook a6 was more efficient, because after rook a6, actually you can simply see the difference between if knight b5, rook c6 cuts the king, and when you take it, you get this check. And now that your king is even cut even more. So if you were to play rook a6 instead of take on b5, instead of coming to b5 and going for the take on a3, it would have been better. And now black's idea is to play knight b5 and go for this pawn, right? So after rook a6, I don't really want to get super deep into it, because it's kind of interesting, because if it was black to move and black were to just take this and keep his king slightly active, it should be a draw and draw-ish endgame. But the problem is that white can simply play a4. And now when the rook takes, you could try and play rook c6, and be cautious that this rook d4 is kind of a blunder because of this fork. So this is a very interesting idea, that if your opponent like plays a move that's trying to prevent your big idea, like rook a6 preventing the idea of rook c6, you can still try to come up with creative ideas to follow up with that, instead of like, a lot of us would want to try and activate our knight, activate our king, but a4 is the right move to keep with your main idea of rook cutting the king, and also distracting black's rook to achieve that. So knight b5, and in this situation, rook wins to c7, probably some checks coming up. Rook f8, defending the pawn. Now is the time to bring in the king and start marching on the king side. So king comes to f3, king comes to e3. The other thing to keep in mind, most likely won't, is something that ideally you would want to do, but most likely won't happen, is that, see how this knight is cut off? If this knight was on g6, it wouldn't be as easy for white to try to win the game. But because this knight is kind of cut off, white can actually try and keep the knight cut off. So, still keeping the knight cut. Even if the knight tries to come out a little breather, f3, not letting the knight to escape. And you still want to play something like knight h6 now. Now you push the pawns. Probably rook e8 would have been slightly smarter, and trying to go for like something like this. But this should be winning for white regardless. Would have probably just made it harder. So king goes to h8, h5. You want to put that pawn on h6 and kind of suffocate the king. And you're not really in a rush. You're just taking your time and putting your pieces in better places. And now with the knight on f1, this is the final move. Think about how the knight is completely cut off. Knight can't go to e3, g3. Knight h2 doesn't make sense because of king g3. And just find this one move and black will resign. Keep in mind that knight can try to escape from d2, the keyword being trying. Well, thank you, Easy. Easy? Yeah. Chess is fun. So, all of the moves that you're suggesting will win, but it's about finding the most accurate for you and the most annoying for your opponent that would make it kind of easier. Ah, yes, Anna, you are right. Pedro, right? I think rook c2 is also pretty accurate, but it's better to keep the rook on the 7th rank. So yeah, we are having a lot of nice suggestions about rook d7. So I think, yeah, thank you. Rook d7 is the right move. So now, white could try to simply play something like rook d1 to pick up the knight. Or white could first play h6 and like wait and kind of make the opponent a little bit more miserable and then try to pick up the knight. But it's kind of nice that this knight, see how here the knight was, whoops, way too far. Here the knight is still cut off, still cut off, still cut off again, and up until the last move the knight is just cut off. So another idea to keep in mind, don't keep your knights on the corners and last ranks because they get cut off really easily. Yeah, that's all I had for today. Unfortunately, Wang Hao didn't win the tournament in Gibraltar, but I do believe he scored the 2nd place. And Praggnanandhaa is one of the upcoming rising super grandmasters from India. And I do believe he is a teenager. I'm not entirely sure about the age. I want to say 14, but I might be wrong. And yeah, so these are the people to keep an eye on for. We'll hear a lot more about them coming up. And I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. So yeah, until next time.